In the humid, languid air of rural North Carolina during the mid-1970s, life was governed by a set of simple, deeply held truths. Faith was not a Sunday obligation, but the very syntax of conversation. Community was not a concept, but a tangible network of shared histories and mutual obligations. And trust, above all, was the essential currency of daily existence. It was extended freely, especially to those who embodied the community's most cherished values. In this world, Margie Velma Barfield was seen as a living testament to those values. She was a woman in her late 50s with a grandmother's gentle face and hands that seemed perpetually occupied with acts of service. Fluffing a pillow, stirring a pot of soup, holding a trembling hand. Her public persona, meticulously crafted over years, was that of a devout, church-going woman whose compassion was as boundless as her faith. It was this unimpeachable reputation that made her a figure of profound reassurance. The person families turned to in times of ultimate vulnerability, when illness and age began their final, inexorable march. Velma's presence at a sickbed was a quiet promise of gentle, dedicated Christian care. This perception, this flawless facade of grandmotherly affection, was the masterful camouflage that concealed a reality so monstrous, so antithetical to everything she appeared to be, that its eventual discovery would leave an indelible scar on the psyche of the community and become a cornerstone case study in the annals of criminal psychology. The final act of Velma Barfield's life as a free woman began, as many of her chapters had, with what appeared to be a love story. After a life marked by the early death of her first husband and a tumultuous second marriage, she had found late-life companionship with a man named Stuart Taylor. Stuart was a respected figure, a widower and tobacco farmer with deep roots in the community. To their friends at church and to their families, they were a content, well-suited pair, finding comfort and solace in each other's company. Their life together settled into a comfortable domestic rhythm. Velma moved into Stuart's home, and soon the house was filled with the sense of her cooking and the quiet hum of their shared life. Their union was seen as a blessing, a gentle and happy conclusion to two lives that had known their share of sorrow. Then, Stuart Taylor fell ill. It began subtly, a general malaise that was easily dismissed as a passing stomach bug, but did not pass. The illness escalated, becoming a perplexing and cruel torment. It moved in vicious, rolling waves, days of excruciating abdominal pain and violent, racking sickness that would inexplicably retreat, granting a brief period of exhausted relief, only to return with even greater, more debilitating force. Velma, in her well-practiced role as the devoted caregiver, was a constant, unwavering presence by his side. She was the picture of loving concern. She nursed him, she prayed for him with a fervor that moved her fellow church members to tears, and she accompanied him on his increasingly frequent and desperate trips to the local hospital. The community watched with a mixture of sympathy and admiration as this kind, strong woman tended to the man she loved, her own face etched with the deep, weary lines of worry and sleepless nights. The medical community was baffled. Doctors at the local hospital and later specialists at larger facilities ran a battery of tests. They explored every conceivable diagnosis, from rare viral infections and foodborne illnesses to severe ulcers and even psychosomatic causes. But every test came back negative or inconclusive. There was no clear pathology, no identifiable source for the agony that was systematically breaking down Stuart Taylor's body. Through it all, Velma's care was the one constant, a bedrock of devotion in a sea of medical uncertainty. She was the gatekeeper of his comfort, the sole administrator of his sustenance. She brought him his favorite sweet tea, brewed strong just the way he liked it. She spoon-fed him broth and soup when he was too weak to lift his own head. She managed the array of medications prescribed by the puzzled doctors, lining them up with a nurse's practiced efficiency. In his rare moments of lucidity, between the waves of pain, Stuart himself could not understand what was happening to his body. The pain was like a fire consuming him from the inside out, a relentless, burning agony that seemed to follow a mysterious pattern. He once remarked to his daughter, his voice weak and laced with confusion, that he often felt his worst shortly after he had taken food or drink from Velma's hands. But such thoughts were fleeting, easily dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a sick and frightened man, his mind clouded by pain and medication. In a world where Velma Barfield was the very embodiment of loving care, to suspect her was an act of madness, a betrayal too profound to contemplate. The thought simply did not compute. In the late summer of 1978, after a final, brutal bout of illness that left him gaunt and broken, Stuart Taylor died. The official cause of death, as listed on the certificate, was an acute stomach ailment of unknown origin. It was a medical shrug, a formal admission of defeat that acknowledged the reality of his death while providing no answer for its cause. The community gathered to grieve with the widow, offering condolences and casseroles, admiring the incredible strength and unwavering faith she had displayed through such a terrible, prolonged ordeal. She had cared for him to the very end. The story should have concluded there, another sad tale of illness and loss to be filed away in the collective memory of a small southern town. But it did not. Stuart Taylor's daughter, Alice, harbored a deep and unsettling suspicion, a cold knot of dread that would not dissolve with her grief. It was more than intuition. It was an accumulation of observed details, small but disturbing inconsistencies that, when pieced together, formed a terrifying and repellent mosaic. During the long weeks of her father's illness, she had seen Velma preparing his food and drink with an almost ritualistic, solitary focus. She recalled her father's confused comment about feeling worse after Velma had tended to him. Most damningly, after her father's death, while sorting through his financial affairs, she made a concrete discovery that turned her vague unease into cold certainty. Velma had been systematically forging checks on her father's bank account. It was not a grand theft, but a series of small, steady withdrawals that spoke of a hidden desperation, a secret life of deceit running parallel to the public one of devout caregiving. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying logic. The mysterious illness, the financial deceit, the unsettling coincidences, it was too much to ignore. Alice's intuition screamed that her father's death was not natural. She confided her fears in other family members, and then, summoning a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed, she went to the police. She laid out her story, her suspicions, and the concrete evidence of the forgeries. She demanded an investigation. Her insistence, born of a daughter's love and a primal sense of injustice, was the single act that pierced the veil of Velma Barfield's carefully constructed world. The authorities, initially skeptical but compelled by the evidence of financial fraud and the conviction in Alice's plea, began the slow, formal process of re-examining the case. The first and most critical step was to petition the court for an order of exhumation. As the legal gears began to turn, whispers started to circulate through the town, disbelief warring with a creeping, unthinkable horror. The kindly Velma, the prayerful grandmother who had wept so convincingly at Stuart's funeral, it was simply impossible. But the quiet certainty in his daughter's eyes suggested that the impossible was about to be proven true. The decision to disturb the dead is never taken lightly, particularly in a community where tradition and reverence for the sanctity of the grave are deeply ingrained. An exhumation is a physical and symbolic violation, a wrenching of a soul from its final rest, undertaken only when the suspicion of a terrible wrong outweighs the profound taboo against it. When the court granted the order to exhume the body of Stuart Taylor, it marked a point of no return. The quiet unease that had been circulating in hushed conversations was now a formal, state-sanctioned inquiry. On a crisp autumn day, a small group of officials gathered in the stillness of the local cemetery. Under the watchful, sorrowful eyes of Alice Taylor and other family members, the heavy work began. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of shovels against earth. As the casket was finally lifted from the ground, a collective shudder seemed to pass through the small gathering. They were not merely unearthing a body. They were unearthing a potential truth so dark it threatened to poison the community's perception of itself, a truth that might prove the most trusted among them was, in fact, a monster. This is where the narrative of Velma Barfield shifts irrevocably, moving from the realm of personal tragedy and suspicion into the cold, methodical, and objective world of forensic science. This transition is a central focus of the case's scholarly analysis, as it demonstrates the critical role of modern toxicology in unmasking quiet killers whose methods are designed to mimic natural disease. The autopsy of Stuart Taylor was not a routine procedure to determine a cause of death, though it was already listed, however vaguely, on his death certificate. This was a forensic autopsy, a specific and targeted search for an external agent, for a chemical ghost that would not appear during standard medical examinations. The pathologists worked with meticulous care, their task made more complex by the natural processes of decomposition. They took tissue samples from Stuart's vital organs, the liver, the kidneys, the stomach lining, as well as hair and fingernail clippings. These samples, carefully sealed and documented, were sent to the state medical examiner's laboratory for a comprehensive toxicological analysis. The weeks that followed were a period of tense anticipation. For Alice Taylor, it was an agony of waiting, a desperate hope that her terrible suspicions would be vindicated, proving she was not mad, while simultaneously dreading the confirmation that her father had been murdered by the woman he loved. For the investigators, it was a time of building a circumstantial case. They painstakingly documented Velma's forgeries, establishing a clear financial motive. They re-interviewed friends, family members, and the doctors who had treated Stuart, creating a timeline of his illness that corresponded with Velma's exclusive control over his food and drink. Yet, they knew that without the science, without the definitive proof from the lab, their case was speculative. Everything hinged on what the toxicology report would reveal. The results, when they finally arrived, were unequivocal, stark, and horrifying. Stuart Taylor's body was saturated with arsenic. It was not a trace amount, not a level that could be explained by environmental exposure. The concentrations found in his liver, the body's primary filter for toxins, were massively elevated, indicating a chronic, repeated exposure over a significant period. Further analysis of his hair provided a grim, chemical timeline. Because hair grows at a relatively constant rate, segments can be tested to show when and in what concentration of poison was introduced into the body. Stuart's hair told a story of escalating doses, a pattern of poisoning that mirrored the rolling waves of his illness. The science was irrefutable. He had not died from a mysterious virus or a failing organ. He had been systematically and deliberately poisoned, a slow, agonizing process administered with chilling patience by the very person who would appear to be his most devoted caregiver. The discovery of arsenic as the murder weapon was, in itself, a profoundly chilling revelation for investigators. As documented in criminological literature on female serial offenders, arsenic has historically been a poison of choice, particularly for women, due to its unique and insidious properties. It is odorless, tasteless, and easily dissolved in food and drink. Crucially, its symptoms, violent nausea, vomiting, excruciating abdominal cramps, and diarrhea, perfectly mimic the signs of severe, naturally occurring gastroenteritis or dysentery. A skilled poisoner can administer it in small, repeated doses, creating a long, baffling illness that sends doctors chasing phantom diagnoses. It is a weapon that offers a high degree of control and a low degree of suspicion. The poisoner can stand at the bedside, offering a comforting cup of tea with one hand while delivering a dose of death with the other, their face a mask of loving concern. The method was not the work of an amateur or someone who had acted in a moment of passion. It was the work of a calculated, patient, and knowledgeable killer. Investigators quickly determined the likely source. In the rural homes of North Carolina at that time, arsenic was a common ingredient in powerful insecticides and rodenticides. Brands of ant and rat poison containing arsenic trioxide were readily available for purchase at any general store or hardware shop. A search of Stuart Taylor's home and property soon uncovered exactly what they were looking for. Several containers of arsenic-based poison tucked away in a shed. Armed with the irrefutable autopsy results and a clear means of delivery, law enforcement arrested Margie Velma Barfield for the first-degree murder of Stuart Taylor. The news spread through the community like a shockwave, leaving a trail of stunned disbelief. The kindly grandmother, the woman who led prayer circles, was now a murder suspect, accused of a crime of almost unimaginable cruelty and deception. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of a police interrogation room, the facade of Jolly Jane finally began to crack. Faced with the stark, scientific proof of her crime, she confessed. But her confession, as meticulously documented in legal transcripts and psychological case studies, was not a simple, straightforward admission of guilt. It was a carefully constructed narrative, a masterpiece of minimization, justification, and deflection designed to frame her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a tragic, flawed figure who had made a terrible mistake. With tears streaming down her face, she recounted a story of desperation. She admitted to her secret addiction to prescription drugs, a shame she had hidden from everyone, including Stuart. She claimed that this addiction had led her to forge checks on his account to get money for pills. Her greatest fear, she said, was that Stuart, a man of pride and principle, would discover her deceit and leave her. It was this fear, she insisted, that drove her to the poison. She admitted to finding the rat poison in the shed and putting a small amount into his tea and beer. But her only intention, she swore, was to make him sick. Just sick enough that he would be bedridden and unable to go to the bank. Just sick enough to buy her some time to figure out what to do. She never, ever meant to kill him, she sobbed. She just lost control of the dosage. She didn't understand how powerful it was. It was a story designed to evoke pity, to reduce a charge of first-degree, premeditated murder to one of manslaughter or second-degree murder. It was the tale of a desperate, addicted woman whose clumsy plan had gone tragically, unintentionally wrong. It painted a picture of panic, not of malice. It was plausible, it was emotional, and it was almost certainly a lie. The cool, methodical patience required for chronic arsenic poisoning, the escalating doses administered over weeks, did not align with a single act of panic desperation. The investigators listening to her tearful, self-serving confession felt a deep and chilling certainty that they were not listening to a woman confessing her first mistake. They were listening to an expert, a serial practitioner of a dark and secret art, who was now using her well-honed skills of deception to try and save herself. They now knew how she killed. The next step was to find out who else. The investigation was just beginning. A single, proven murder can be explained away, however tenuously, as a tragic aberration, a singular moral collapse born of desperation and poor judgment. Velma Barfield's confession regarding Stuart Taylor was a masterclass in this very narrative. She was a good woman pushed to a desperate act by the secret shame of addiction and theft. But for seasoned investigators, a crime as patient, methodical, and psychologically complex as chronic arsenic poisoning rarely exists in a vacuum. It suggests a pre-existing knowledge, a horrifying level of comfort with a dark and intimate form of violence. The investigators, now armed with the irrefutable toxicology report from Stuart Taylor's autopsy, were convinced they were not looking at a one-time offender. They were looking at the culmination of a career. Their task now was to turn back the pages of Velma Barfield's life, to look past the smiling photographs in the family album and search for the ghosts they were now certain were hiding there. This retrospective investigation, a core component of the scholarly case study of Velma Barfield, would reveal a consistent and terrifying pattern of sudden, mysterious deaths that followed in her wake, transforming the case from a single homicide into the chilling chronicle of a serial poisoner. The first and most logical place to look was at the death of her second husband, Jennings J.D. Barfield. He had died in 1971, 7 years before Stuart Taylor. By all accounts, their marriage had been a turbulent one, marked by arguments and Velma's escalating dependence on prescription medication. Towards the end of his life, Jennings, much like Stuart Taylor would years later, had fallen victim to a perplexing and debilitating illness. His medical records, exhumed from dusty archives, painted a familiar, grim picture. Severe and recurring bouts of violent gastrointestinal distress, burning stomach pain, and a steady, inexplicable decline in health. At the time, with no reason to suspect foul play, his death had been officially attributed to heart complications and cirrhosis of the liver, common enough diagnoses for a man of his age and lifestyle. But now, through the new, horrifying lens of the Stuart Taylor case, those symptoms screamed of arsenic. The very same pattern, the same agonizing decline, had played out years earlier. While Jennings Barfield's body was not exhumed for analysis, the parallels were too strong to be coincidental. The investigators had found their first ghost. The next ghost they sought was even more unsettling, a violation of a bond considered more sacred than marriage. They turned their attention to the death of Velma's own mother, Lily Bullard. Lily had passed away in 1974, just 3 years after Jennings Barfield. The circumstances surrounding her death were now re-examined with a cold, clinical eye. Lily, an elderly but reportedly robust woman, had died after a sudden and severe bout of diarrhea and vomiting. At the time, it was mourned as a sad but natural passing. But the investigators, interviewing family members again, uncovered a crucial piece of context that had been overlooked. Lily's precipitous illness had begun immediately following a heated and bitter argument with Velma. The subject of the argument was Velma's lifestyle, specifically her escalating prescription drug abuse and the family's discovery that she had been forging checks on her parents' bank account. This revelation was a watershed moment in the investigation. It established a clear and repeated motive that went beyond a simple desire to cover up theft from a lover. It suggested a deeper, more chilling pattern. Velma Barfield responded to confrontation and the threat of exposure with lethal force. The argument with her mother represented a direct threat to her supply of drugs and money. Lily Bullard, in that moment, had become an obstacle. Shortly thereafter, she developed the telltale symptoms of what investigators now recognized as arsenic poisoning and died. While Lily Bullard's body was also not exhumed, the circumstantial evidence was damning. It painted a portrait of a woman who was not just a black widow targeting husbands and lovers for financial gain, but who was capable of the almost unthinkable act of matricide to protect her secrets and feed her addiction. The kindly, church-going daughter persona now seemed like a grotesque masquerade. The investigation was now peeling back layers of deception, revealing a history far darker than a single accidental poisoning. They realized Velma's methodology was a honed and practiced skill. Under the weight of this accumulating evidence from her family history, and confronted with the investigators' pointed questions about her mother and second husband, Velma Barfield's initial story began to crumble. The narrative of a one-time, accidental poisoning of Stuart Taylor was no longer tenable. In the interrogation room, her composure finally broke. She confessed. She admitted to poisoning Jennings Barfield. She admitted to poisoning her own mother, Lily Bullard. The quiet horror of what they were dealing with began to settle upon the investigators. They were in the presence of a woman who had systematically eliminated her own family members when they became inconvenient. But the list of ghosts was not yet complete. The investigators widened their search beyond Velma's immediate family, looking into her activities as a professional caregiver, a role she had taken on frequently between her marriages and other jobs. This is where the case solidifies Velma Barfield's profile as an angel of death, a specific and terrifying subtype of serial killer extensively analyzed in criminological and medical legal literature. The angel of death is typically a caregiver who uses their position of trust and their access to the vulnerable to kill. Their motives can be complex, sometimes involving a twisted sense of mercy, but often, as in Velma's case, revolving around a need for power, control, and financial gain. The investigators uncovered the tragic cases of two elderly people, John Henry and Dolly Lee, for whom Velma had acted as a private nurse and companion in the mid-1970s. Their story was a grim echo of the others. John Henry Lee, an elderly man in failing health, had died first. His demise was attributed to his advanced age and a severe stomach ailment. Velma, who had been his devoted caregiver, was praised for the comfort she provided in his final days. Shortly after his death, his wife, Dolly, who had also been under Velma's care, fell sick with a similar, violent illness. She too died, her passing mourned as the result of a broken heart and old age. The community had seen it as a sad love story, a devoted couple unable to live apart. The investigators, however, saw something else entirely. They pulled the financial records and discovered the familiar, ugly pattern of forged checks and stolen money. They interviewed relatives of the Lees who recalled how Velma had seemed to take over their lives, isolating the elderly couple and managing all their affairs with an unsettling degree of control. They heard descriptions of the same mysterious, rolling illness that had afflicted all of Velma's other victims. Faced with this new line of inquiry, Velma confessed to these murders as well. The story she told was chilling in its mundanity. She needed money for her pills, and the Lees were a convenient source. When she feared her thefts would be discovered, she had turned to her trusted solution, the small, potent doses of arsenic-laced poison administered in drinks and food with a caring hand. The scope of her crimes was now breathtaking. This woman, who had presented herself to the world as a pillar of compassion, was now a confessed serial murderer. She had poisoned her own mother, her husband, a man she professed to love, and the helpless elderly people who had been placed in her absolute trust. Each murder had followed the same cold, calculated script. First, she would ingratiate herself, establishing a position of care and dependency. Second, she would begin to steal, forging checks to fuel her addiction. Third, when she felt the risk of exposure grew too great, either through a direct confrontation or the simple fear of discovery, she would begin to administer the poison. The deaths were never quick. They were slow, agonizing affairs that allowed her to play the role of the devoted, grieving caregiver to a captive audience, a performance that seemingly fulfilled a deep psychological need for attention and sympathy while simultaneously eliminating the threat. The family album was now a gallery of victims, each smiling face a testament to her profound and monstrous betrayal. The question for investigators and the legal system was no longer if she was a killer, but why? What could possibly create a mind so divorced from human empathy that it could perform such acts, not once but over and over again? The answer, the defense would soon argue, lay in a place even darker and more complex than a simple story of addiction and greed. It lay in the fractured labyrinth of her own mind. The confessions regarding her mother and husband had peeled back the facade of a loving family member, revealing a cold-blooded domestic predator. But it was the investigation into Velma Barfield's activities as a professional caregiver that transitioned her case into a different and perhaps even more chilling category of criminal pathology. This is where her story becomes a definitive case study of the angel of death, or angel of mercy, a specific and disturbing subtype of serial killer extensively analyzed in criminological and medical legal literature. These offenders are almost always healthcare workers or private caregivers who use their specialized access, their knowledge, and the profound trust placed in them to harm those they are supposed to protect. Their motives are varied. Some kill for a twisted sense of mercy, others for financial gain, and some, the most psychologically complex, for the intoxicating sense of power and control over life and death. The investigation into the deaths of John Henry and Dolly Lee would demonstrate that Velma Barfield's pathology was a chilling amalgam of all three, solidifying her place in the grim pantheon of medical murderers. John Henry Lee and his wife, Dolly, were fixtures in their small North Carolina community. They were elderly, frail, and living out their final years in the quiet dignity of their family home. As their health declined, their family made the decision that so many do, They sought a private caregiver to provide companionship and assist with the daily tasks that had become too burdensome. Their search led them to Velma Barfield. Her reputation preceded her. She was known as a woman of immense patience, a devout Christian whose very presence was a comfort. She was, by all accounts, the perfect candidate. When Velma entered the Lee household in the mid-1970s, she did so under a banner of compassion and trust, welcomed by a grateful family who believed they had found a godsend. For a time, everything seemed to be just that. Velma was attentive and diligent. She managed the household, cooked meals, administered medications, and read from the Bible to the elderly couple. She integrated herself so completely into their lives that she became not just a caregiver, but an indispensable part of their daily existence. From a criminological perspective, this initial phase of ingratiation is a critical part of the predatory process for this type of offender. It is the stage of building absolute trust and dependency, ensuring that the caregiver's actions, no matter how suspicious they might later seem in hindsight, are initially viewed through a lens of unwavering faith and gratitude. Velma became the sole gatekeeper to the Lees' well-being, a position of immense and unchecked power. The first to die was John Henry Lee. His health, already fragile, took a sudden and sharp decline. He began to suffer from the now familiar litany of symptoms: severe, burning stomach pain, relentless vomiting, and a weakness that left him completely bedridden. The family and their doctor attributed it to his advanced age and the natural, cruel progression of his existing ailments. Through this final, agonizing illness, Velma was a paragon of devotion. She sat by his bedside for hours, wiping his brow, offering him sips of water and broth, and comforting him with scripture. When he finally passed away, his death was seen as a sad but expected event. Velma's grief was public and profound, and the family lauded her for the incredible kindness she had shown him in his last days. With John Henry gone, Velma's focus shifted entirely to his widow, Dolly. Now alone and grieving, Dolly Lee became even more dependent on her caregiver. It was not long before she, too, began to fall ill. The symptoms were a horrifying echo of her late husband's. The same violent gastrointestinal distress, the same inexplicable decline. The doctor was again called, but could offer no relief, diagnosing her with what seemed to be a combination of severe stomach virus and the physical manifestation of broken heart. Dolly's children watched in horror as their mother, who had been relatively stable, withered away before their eyes. Once again, Velma was the tireless angel at the bedside, nursing Dolly through her final, painful days. When Dolly Lee died shortly after her husband, the community saw it as the poignant, romanticized end to a long love story, a devoted wife unable to live without her husband. But the investigators, looking at these events years later with the cold clarity of suspicion, sought a completely different narrative. They saw a script, a practiced and methodical double murder. They secured the financial records for the Lee estate, and there, in the neat columns of the bank ledgers, was the familiar, ugly signature of Velma's greed. A series of forged checks, written in a hand that expertly mimicked Dolly Lee's frail signature, had been cashed during the period of her illness. The amounts were not enormous, just enough to supplement Velma's income and, more importantly, to finance her hidden and ever-present prescription drug addiction. The motive was clear and consistent with her other crimes. Confronted with the evidence of the forgeries and the striking similarity of the Lee's deaths to those of her own family members, Velma Barfield confessed to these murders as well. Her account of these crimes, as documented in her official statements, was delivered with a chilling matter-of-factness that betrayed the absence of any real empathy. The Lees, in her telling, were simply a means to an end. She needed money for her pills, and they were an easy, trusting source. When she feared that her thefts would be discovered, perhaps by a visiting family member or a bank teller questioning a signature, she turned to her trusted and practiced solution. The horror of these particular crimes lies in their prolonged and intimate nature. This was not a fleeting act of violence. It was a calculated, daily campaign of poisoning, administered under the guise of care. Every spoonful of soup, every glass of tea that Velma offered to the ailing couple may have been laced with arsenic. The very hands that fluffed their pillows and straightened their sheets were the same hands that were methodically killing them. This psychological dynamic is central to the angel of death profile. The offender often derives a profound, narcissistic gratification from this dual role. They are both the source of the suffering and the sole provider of comfort. This creates a theater of absolute control where the killer can play God, holding the power of life and death in their hands, all while receiving praise and adoration for their perceived devotion. The sympathy and gratitude of the grieving families become a form of psychological payment, feeding the offender's need for attention and validation. In a later, more expansive confession, Velma provided a detail that added another layer of complexity to her motivations. She claimed that she sometimes killed because she couldn't bear to see her victims suffer. This statement has been the subject of significant psychological analysis. Was it a genuine, albeit deeply twisted, form of mercy killing, a pathological need to end the suffering she herself was causing? Or was it, more likely, another self-serving rationalization, a way for her to reframe her selfish, financially motivated crimes as acts of compassion, thereby mitigating her own guilt? Most forensic psychologists lean towards the latter interpretation. The financial motive was consistent in every case, and the mercy aspect only emerged after she had already established a pattern of theft. It was another mask, another story to make the monstrous truth more palatable, both for her audience and perhaps for herself. The murders of John Henry and Dolly Lee solidified the investigators' understanding of Velma Barfield. She was not just a domestic killer who targeted family members who stood in her way. She was a professional predator who weaponized her chosen career. The sick room was her hunting ground. The trust of desperate families was her camouflage. The tools of comfort, food, drink, and medicine, were her instruments of death. With these final confessions, the picture was complete. The kindly caregiver was now undeniably one of the most prolific female serial killers in modern American history. The case against her was no longer just about the death of Stuart Taylor. It was a vast and horrifying chronicle of betrayal, a testament to a woman who had turned the sacred act of caring into a cold and practiced art of killing. The next stage of her story would move from the quiet bedrooms of the sick to the public arena of the courtroom, where the battle would shift from discovering her crimes to trying to understand the mind that committed them. The journey from a police interrogation room to a court of law is a formal and transformative process. It is the point where a collection of grim facts, witness statements, and forensic reports must be woven into a coherent legal narrative. With Velma Barfield's multiple confessions secured, the prosecution, led by the formidable District Attorney Joe Freeman Britt, believed they had an open and shut case. They possessed a signed admission to the murder of Stuart Taylor, corroborating confessions to at least 3 other homicides, and the irrefutable scientific proof of chronic arsenic poisoning. The case against the woman now being dubbed the Death Row Granny by an astonished press appeared to be an unassailable fortress of evidence. The impending trial was expected to be a grim but straightforward legal formality, culminating in a swift conviction. But the defense team, led by a dedicated public defender, understood that a conventional defense was not only impossible but suicidal. To argue that Velma Barfield had not committed the acts was to argue against her own words and against the cold, hard science of toxicology. They could not contest the what, the when, or the how of her crimes. Their only available strategy, and a daring one at that, was to pivot the entire case away from the physical evidence and into the murky, subjective, and treacherous territory of the human mind. Their goal was to fundamentally challenge the why. The trial of Velma Barfield would not be a debate over her actions, but a profound and controversial exploration of her criminal responsibility. It would become a battle fought not with fingerprints and autopsy reports, but with psychiatric theories, traumatic memories, and the very definition of legal sanity. This is where the Velma Barfield case becomes a landmark in the annals of American jurisprudence and forensic psychology. The defense constructed a sophisticated, dual-pronged argument designed to dismantle the prosecution's portrayal of her as a cold, calculating, and rational killer. The first pillar of their defense was a well-documented and factually solid claim. Velma Barfield was a chronic and severe prescription drug abuser. This was not a contested point. For years, she had been caught in a cycle of doctor shopping and forging prescriptions to obtain vast quantities of tranquilizers, primarily Valium, but also a cocktail of other sedatives and painkillers. Her addiction was a central, driving force in her life, a secret shame that fueled her constant need for money and her elaborate deceptions. Her lawyers argued that this long-term, high-dosage drug abuse was not merely a character flaw or a motive for theft. It was a fundamental pathological state. They presented expert testimony from pharmacologists and physicians who explained how years of such substance abuse could alter brain chemistry, impair cognitive function, and erode a person's capacity for sound judgment and impulse control. They painted a picture of a woman operating in a perpetual, drug-induced fog, her moral compass shattered by her addiction. Under this theory, the poisonings were not the product of a clear-headed, malicious intent, but the reckless, ill-conceived actions of a woman whose mind was so clouded by drugs that she was no longer capable of fully grasping the lethal consequences of her behavior. This argument aimed to mitigate her culpability, to reduce the charge from the capital offense of first-degree murder to a lesser charge like second-degree murder or manslaughter, which would spare her from the death penalty. But it was the second pillar of their defense that would transform the trial from a notable murder case into a national sensation and a subject of intense academic debate for decades to come. The defense team made a bold and controversial claim. They argued that Velma Barfield suffered from a severe psychiatric condition, dissociative identity disorder, then more popularly and less clinically known as multiple personality disorder. This was a defense that had rarely been attempted and almost never successfully in a capital murder trial. It proposed a radical reinterpretation of the events. The crimes, they argued, the thefts, the lies, the poisonings were not committed by the primary personality known to the world as Velma, the gentle, loving, and deeply religious grandmother. They were, instead, the work of a separate, hidden, and malevolent alter ego. During extensive psychiatric evaluations conducted for the defense, this alternate personality was given a name, Billy. The emergence of Billy was a dramatic and pivotal moment in the pretrial proceedings. According to the defense's narrative, Billy was a violent, angry, and resentful personality, a psychic splinter that had been created decades earlier by the profound and unspeakable trauma of Velma's childhood. It was Billy, the defense claimed, who held all the rage and resentment that Velma, the primary host personality, could not consciously acknowledge. It was Billy who seethed with anger at her mother's authority. It was Billy who harbored a cold bitterness toward her husbands. It was Billy who was driven by greed and a reckless desire for the pills that would quiet the turmoil in her mind. And, most crucially, it was Billy who coolly and calmly mixed the arsenic-laced poison into the cups of tea and beer. According to this psychological model, the personality of Velma was merely a horrified, often amnesiac, bystander to the actions of this other self. She would experience lost time, periods for which she had no memory. She would wake up, her lawyers argued, to discover that money had been stolen or that a person in her care was suddenly, inexplicably ill. She was, in this telling, as much a victim of Billy as the people he had poisoned. She was a woman whose mind was a fractured prison, with the warden of her consciousness unable to control the violent inmate locked away in a hidden cell. This extraordinary defense necessitated a deep and harrowing dive into Velma's developmental history, a process that peeled back the layers of her seemingly simple rural life to reveal a foundation of almost unimaginable pain. Under psychiatric evaluation, and later in court testimony, a story of severe, chronic childhood abuse emerged. Velma, born Honora Kelly, described a home life defined by abject poverty and the terrifying presence of her father. She recounted incidents of extreme physical and psychological abuse, culminating in her claim that she had been subjected to horrific and repeated sexual abuse by him. She described fleeing this abuse, only to be caught and brought back into the home where the trauma continued. From the perspective of trauma-focused psychology, this history is critically significant. Established theories on the etiology of dissociative identity disorder posit that it is almost always a creative and desperate coping mechanism developed in response to overwhelming, inescapable childhood trauma. When a child's reality is too painful to bear, the mind can fracture, compartmentalizing the trauma into separate personality states. One personality, the host, continues to navigate the world, often with no memory of the abuse, while another personality, the alter, is created to hold the pain, the rage, and the memories. The defense argued that Billy was precisely such a creation, a psychic bodyguard born from the fires of Velma's childhood trauma. The trial was thus set. It would not be a simple presentation of facts, but a profound and complex journey into the labyrinth of a single human mind. The prosecution would argue that they were prosecuting one woman, Velma Barfield, a calculating killer. The defense would argue that the woman in the defendant's chair was merely a vessel, and that the true culprit, the entity named Billy, was a ghost born of trauma, a phantom who could not be held responsible in the same way. The jury would be asked to become not just arbiters of fact, but judges of a fractured soul. The courtroom is, by design, a theater of reason. It is a stage where narratives are constructed and deconstructed through a rigid process of evidence, testimony, and legal argument. But the trial of Velma Barfield was destined to transcend these conventional boundaries, transforming the staid North Carolina courtroom into a dramatic arena for one of the most abstract and profound questions that can be put before a jury. What is the nature of a self? As the trial commenced, the prosecution, led by the methodical and imposing District Attorney Joe Freeman Britt, laid out their case with brutal simplicity. They presented the undeniable facts: the bodies, the autopsies, the toxicology reports confirming arsenic poisoning, the trail of forged checks establishing a clear financial motive, and most powerfully, Velma Barfield's own signed confessions. Britt's narrative was linear and unambiguous. He painted a portrait of a greedy, manipulative, and coldly rational woman who used a mask of kindness to prey on the vulnerable, killing them for money to support her drug habit. The case, he argued, was a simple, if horrifying, matter of greed and murder. Then, the defense began their case, and the trial pivoted from the world of concrete evidence into the complex, often confounding labyrinth of forensic psychiatry. Their entire strategy rested on convincing the jury of a reality that seemed to belong more to fiction than to a court of law. They sought to prove the existence of Billy, the malevolent alter ego they claimed was the true author of the crimes. This set the stage for a classic battle of the experts, a central feature of modern insanity defense trials that is heavily analyzed in legal and psychological scholarship. The defense called their own psychiatrist to the stand, who had spent dozens of hours evaluating Velma. They testified that, in their professional opinion, Velma Barfield met the clinical criteria for what was then known as multiple personality disorder. They described her traumatic childhood as the clear etiological source of her condition. The abuse she suffered, they explained, was so severe that her young mind had been forced to fracture as a survival mechanism. Velma, the host personality, was the one who went to church, who cared for her children, who presented a kind face to the world. Billy, the alter, was the psychic container for all the rage, fear, and pain she could not consciously process. Under oath, these experts described their sessions with Velma, recounting how, under specific questioning or emotional stress, her entire demeanor would shift. Her voice would deepen, her posture would become more aggressive, and she would refer to herself as Billy. This Billy personality, they testified, spoke freely and often contemptuously of Velma, whom he viewed as weak and pathetic. It was Billy who admitted to the anger, the resentment, and the crimes, often in a boastful or detached tone that stood in stark contrast to Velma's tearful and remorseful presentation. The defense argued that Velma herself had no executive control when Billy was dominant. She would experience amnesiac episodes, or lost time, and would have no memory of forging checks or administering poison. She was, in their psychiatric model, a passenger in her own body, subject to the whims of a dangerous and unpredictable pilot. They argued that because the intent to kill, the mens rea required for a first-degree murder conviction, resided within the personality of Billy and not within the primary personality of Velma, she could not be held fully criminally responsible. The prosecution countered this extraordinary claim with a methodical and deeply skeptical assault on the validity of both the diagnosis and the experts who made it. Joe Freeman Britt cross-examined the defense psychiatrists with surgical precision, attempting to portray them as either dupes of a cunning manipulator or proponents of a fringe and proven psychiatric theory. He questioned their methods, suggesting that the Billy personality had been inadvertently co-created or suggested by the therapists themselves during their interviews, a psychological phenomenon known as iatrogenesis. He raised the possibility that Velma, a woman of average intelligence but considerable low cunning, had learned about the symptoms of multiple personality disorder from books or television and was now engaged in a sophisticated and desperate act of malingering or faking a mental illness to save her own life. To bolster this argument, the prosecution called their own slate of psychiatric experts. These psychiatrists, often with more conservative or biologically oriented perspectives, testified that while Velma Barfield was clearly a woman with a troubled history and a severe personality disorder, there is insufficient credible evidence to support a diagnosis of DID. They pointed to the convenient timing of Billy's appearance, emerging only after her arrest and when she was facing a capital charge. They emphasized her highly organized and methodical behavior during the commission of the crimes. Chronic arsenic poisoning, they argued, requires patience, planning, and consistent action over a long period. This sustained, goal-oriented behavior was, in their view, fundamentally inconsistent with the chaotic and fragmented mental state of a person with a genuine dissociative disorder. A truly fractured mind, they contended, would be unlikely to carry out such a long-term, calculated campaign of murder and deception. They argued that Velma's actions were better explained by a more straightforward diagnosis, a severe antisocial or borderline personality disorder, combined with substance dependence. She was not fractured. She was simply a psychopath who lacked empathy and remorse, a manipulative individual who had now constructed her most elaborate lie. The climax of this psychological drama unfolded when Velma Barfield herself took the stand. Her testimony was a masterclass in performance, shifting between two distinct personas in a way that captivated and divided the courtroom. As Velma, she was soft-spoken, weepy, and remorseful. She spoke of her love for her family and for Stuart Taylor, expressing confusion and horror at the crimes attributed to her. She described the lost time, the blackouts, and the vague, terrifying feeling that another presence existed within her. Then, under the pressure of cross-examination, the shift would occur. Her eyes would harden. Her voice would drop in pitch and gain a rougher, more aggressive edge. She would begin to speak as Billy. Billy was defiant, arrogant, and contemptuous. He spoke of that woman, Velma, with disdain. He freely admitted to the anger and the desire for money. While he never made a direct, unequivocal confession to the murders on the stand, his presence was designed to be its own testimony, a live demonstration of the fractured mind the defense was claiming. For the jury, it was a dizzying and unprecedented spectacle. They were being asked to become amateur psychiatrists, to weigh competing theories of the mind and decide which was more plausible. Was the weeping grandmother on the stand the real Velma? Or was the sneering, defiant voice of Billy the true face of the killer? Or were they both just roles being played by a single, cunning actress fighting for her life? The prosecution hammered on this last point in their closing arguments. They asked the jury to look past the psychological theater and focus on the undisputed facts. The consistent financial motive, the pattern of deceit that predated any claim of a second personality, and the trail of bodies left in her wake. They argued that whether her name was Velma or Billy, the hands that forged the checks and mixed the poison were the same. The mind that planned the crimes, they insisted, was a single, unified, and legally sane mind. The jury was left to retreat into the deliberation room, tasked not only with judging a crime, but with rendering a verdict on the very nature of a human soul. The atmosphere in the North Carolina courtroom was heavy with a unique and profound tension as the jury filed out to begin their deliberations. They had been presented with two fundamentally irreconcilable realities. The prosecution's narrative was a stark, linear story of greed and betrayal, grounded in the tangible world of toxicology reports, bank records, and signed confessions. It was a world of knowable facts and rational motives. The defense, in stark contrast, had guided them on a journey into the fog-shrouded, theoretical landscape of a fractured human mind. Theirs was a narrative of childhood trauma, repressed memories, and warring internal identities, a world where the very concept of a unified, responsible self was called into question. The 12 men and women of the jury were now tasked with bridging this chasm. They had to choose a story. Their decision would not only determine the fate of Velma Barfield, but would also serve as a public verdict on the legal viability of one of the most complex and controversial psychiatric defenses ever mounted in a capital case. Inside the deliberation room, the central conflict revolved around the testimony of Billy. This is the part of the legal process that scholarly analysis can only infer from post-trial interviews and legal commentary. But the core questions are clear. Jurors had to grapple with whether they believed in the authenticity of the alter ego. Had they witnessed a genuine manifestation of a severe, trauma-induced mental illness on the witness stand? Or had they been subjected to a highly skilled, desperate performance by a cunning manipulator? They would have debated the competing expert testimonies, weighing the defense psychiatrist theories of dissociation against the prosecution's more straightforward diagnosis of a psychopathic personality disorder. Crucially, they would have returned to the concrete evidence. The prosecution's closing arguments had relentlessly hammered home the consistency and organization required to carry out the crimes. The jurors would have considered the methodical nature of chronic arsenic poisoning, the need to procure the poison, to administer it in controlled, repeated doses over weeks or months, all while maintaining a facade of loving care. They would have weighed this calculated, long-term behavior against the defense's portrayal of a chaotic, fragmented mind with amnesiac barriers between personalities. Could a person truly be unaware of such a sustained and complex series of actions? The sheer logistical reality of the crimes likely served as a powerful anchor, pulling the jury back from the abstract theories of the mind and grounding them in the undeniable evidence of planned, goal-oriented behavior. The consistent financial motive, present in every single one of her confessed murders, provided a simple, rational explanation for her actions that the complex Billy narrative struggled to refute. Greed was a motive the jury understood. A murderous alter ego born of trauma was a far more difficult concept to accept as legal fact. After what was, by all accounts, a relatively short period of deliberation for a capital case of such psychological complexity, the jury returned. The courtroom fell into a tense, breathless silence as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The question of her sanity, of the existence of Billy, was answered first. The jury found that Velma Barfield was legally sane at the time of the crimes and fully responsible for her actions. They had rejected the dissociative identity disorder defense. They had chosen the prosecution's narrative. The legal system, in this instance, sided with the tangible over the theoretical. The verdict on the primary charge followed swiftly. On the count of the first-degree murder of Stuart Taylor, the foreman announced the single, devastating word, guilty. A wave of quiet gasps and muffled sobs rippled through the courtroom. For Alice Taylor and her family, it was a moment of profound, if somber, vindication. The legal system had officially affirmed their terrible truth. For Velma Barfield, the verdict was the shattering of her last and most elaborate defense. The mask of the fractured victim had been stripped away, leaving her exposed, in the eyes of the law, as nothing more than a common, if exceptionally deceitful, murderer. The trial then moved into its second phase, the sentencing. In a capital case, after a guilty verdict, the jury is asked to weigh aggravating and mitigating factors to decide between a sentence of life in prison or death. The prosecution presented the aggravating factors with grim efficiency. Velma Barfield was a multiple murderer. The crime was committed for financial gain. It was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, involving a prolonged period of torture through poison. The evidence for these factors was overwhelming. The defense, in turn, represented their arguments as mitigating factors. They pleaded with the jury to consider her traumatic childhood, her long-standing battle with prescription drug addiction, and her disordered personality, even if it did not meet the legal standard for insanity. They portrayed her as a broken woman, a product of a lifetime of pain, who deserved mercy, not retribution. They put her family members on the stand to testify about the good Velma, the loving mother and grandmother they knew, hoping to humanize her in the eyes of the jury and show them the person who existed outside of the monstrous acts she had committed. This is a crucial moment in any capital case study, where the legal system must balance the horror of the crime against the humanity, however flawed, of the perpetrator. But for the jury that had just sat through weeks of testimony detailing the slow, agonizing deaths of multiple victims at the hands of their trusted caregiver, the arguments for mercy fell short. The betrayal was too profound, the calculated cruelty too immense. They returned with their final decision. The court clerk asked for their recommendation on the sentence, and the foreman confirmed their unanimous verdict, death. A palpable shock settled over the courtroom. While the guilty verdict was largely expected after the rejection of the Billy defense, the death sentence for a grandmother was a jarring and historic outcome. In the 1980s, it was exceedingly rare for a woman to be sentenced to death in the United States, regardless of the severity of her crime. The image of the death row granny, a name that would come to define her in the media, was born in that moment. Velma Barfield became a symbol, a stark and unsettling figure who defied the conventional public archetypes of both grandmothers and death row inmates. The verdict and sentence sent shockwaves far beyond the small North Carolina community. It became a national story, analyzed in newspapers and on television screens across the country. For legal scholars, it served as a significant data point on the use of psychiatric defenses in capital cases, demonstrating the high bar such defenses must clear to be successful. For criminologists, it solidified Velma Barfield's place in the taxonomy of serial offenders, a classic example of the Black Widow poisoner. But for Velma Barfield herself, it marked the beginning of the final chapter of her life. The legal battle for her life was lost, but a new, more public battle for her soul was about to begin on death row. The verdict had been rendered, but the story was far from over. The transition from the public glare of a courtroom to the stark, monastic reality of death row is a journey into a suspended state of being. For Velma Barfield, the iron door that closed behind her at North Carolina's Correctional Center for Women marked the end of her life as an active participant in the world and the beginning of her existence as a symbol. The jury had rendered its verdict, defining her in legal terms as a calculating, remorseless killer. But in the years of appeals that followed, she would undergo a final, profound transformation, one that would present the public, the legal system, and the scholarly community with one last, unanswerable question. Can a person who has committed monstrous acts truly be redeemed? And if so, what does that redemption mean in the face of ultimate justice? This final chapter of her life is a compelling case study in the psychology of conversion, manipulation, and the complex interplay between faith and the criminal mind. Life on death row for Velma Barfield was, by all accounts, starkly different from the turbulent and deceitful life she had led outside its walls. The chaos of her addiction, the constant need for money, and the elaborate web of lies that had defined her existence were replaced by a world of rigid routine and quiet introspection. It was in this environment that she began what would become her most famous and most debated persona, that of the devout, born-again Christian. While she had always maintained a public affiliation with the church, her newfound faith on death row was characterized by an intensity and fervor that captivated many who encountered her. She spent her days immersed in scripture, her small cell filled with religious texts and correspondence. She became a source of spiritual counsel for other inmates, leading prayer groups and offering guidance with a grandmotherly warmth that seemed, to many, utterly genuine. This transformation was not a private affair. It quickly became a public narrative, championed by a growing number of supporters who saw her not as a monster, but as a prodigal daughter who had found her way back to God. Her story was amplified by prominent religious figures and abolitionist groups who saw her case as a powerful argument against capital punishment. If a person could undergo such a profound and sincere spiritual rebirth, they argued, what moral purpose was served by executing them? This is where Velma Barfield's case transcends a simple criminal profile and enters the realm of theological and ethical debate, a subject frequently analyzed in scholarly articles on religion, law, and capital punishment. Her supporters, including figures associated with the Reverend Billy Graham, presented her as a living testament to the power of divine grace. They circulated her letters, filled with expressions of deep remorse for her crimes and a serene acceptance of God's will. They pointed to her exemplary behavior as a prisoner, her calm demeanor, and her work ministering to others as proof of her authentic conversion. From a psychological perspective, this final transformation is the most complex and ambiguous part of her story. Scholarly analysis of her state of mind during this period offers several competing interpretations. The first, and most charitable, is that her conversion was entirely genuine. Faced with the stark reality of her own mortality and forced, perhaps for the first time, to confront the enormity of her actions without the haze of drugs or the distraction of deceit, she underwent a true psychological and spiritual crisis that led to a sincere embrace of faith. In this view, the good Velma, that her family had always claimed to know, the one buried under years of trauma and addiction, had finally, in the shadow of death, re-emerged. This interpretation sees her remorse as authentic and her newfound peace as a legitimate psychological state. A second, more cynical interpretation, favored by many forensic psychologists and criminologists, views her conversion as the ultimate and most sophisticated act of manipulation in a lifetime filled with them. In this model, Velma Barfield was a consummate performer, a woman with a profound, almost instinctual ability to adopt the persona that best suited her needs in any given situation. She had played the role of the devoted caregiver, the grieving widow, and the fractured victim of Billy. Now, facing execution, she adopted the one role that could plausibly save her life, the redeemed penitent. This perspective does not necessarily imply a conscious, daily act of cynical deception. For a personality as disordered as hers, the lines between performance and belief can become hopelessly blurred. She may have convinced herself of her own redemption because the psychological alternative, fully integrating the knowledge of her monstrous acts without a mitigating narrative, was simply unbearable. The conversion, in this view, was the final, most powerful defense mechanism, a way to reframe her identity to make her continued existence psychologically possible and, she might have hoped, legally tenable. A third, more nuanced psychological analysis suggests that the truth lies somewhere between these two poles. It posits that Velma may have had a genuine religious experience, but that this experience coexisted with her deeply ingrained manipulative personality traits. She could be both genuinely remorseful for the pain she caused and simultaneously aware that presenting herself as a model Christian penitent was her best and only hope for clemency. For a personality built on layers of deception and self-deception, sincerity and manipulation are not necessarily mutually exclusive. She could find real comfort in her faith while also instinctively understanding its strategic value. This interpretation sees her not as a simple saint or sinner, but as a profoundly complex and damaged individual, forever navigating the world through a series of masks, even in her final days. Her public persona as the Death Row Granny solidified this complex image. The moniker itself was a juxtaposition of comforting familiarity and ultimate transgression, capturing the public's conflicted fascination with her case. She gave interviews, her voice calm and grandmotherly, speaking of God's love and forgiveness. These interviews were powerful and, for many, deeply convincing. They showcased a woman who seemed at peace, a stark contrast to the angry, defiant Billy persona that had been presented at her trial. This created a profound public and legal dilemma. The woman who now resided on death row seemed, in many ways, to be a different person from the one who had committed the murders years earlier. The legal system, however, operates on the principle of a continuous self. The person who committed the crime is the same person who must face the punishment, regardless of any subsequent internal transformation. Velma Barfield's case became a high-profile test of this principle, pitting the legal concept of unchanging identity against the theological concept of spiritual rebirth. The years ticked by, her appeals slowly making their way through the courts, while she continued to live out her final role as the redeemed woman, a symbol of hope for some and a master manipulator for others, leaving the world to wonder which, if any, was the real Velma Barfield. The machinery of capital punishment moves with a slow, deliberate, and often grinding pace. For Velma Barfield, the years on death row were a protracted legal war, a battle fought on multiple fronts by a dedicated team of appellate lawyers who sought to find a single crack in the fortress of her conviction and sentence. Each appeal filed was not just a legal document, but a carefully crafted argument designed to relitigate the core questions of her case in the higher courts. This final stage of her story is a compelling case study in the American appellate process, particularly in its handling of complex issues surrounding mental health, ineffective counsel, and the fundamental question of whether the state should execute a seemingly transformed individual. The primary thrust of her appeals continued to center on the psychiatric defense that had failed at her trial. Her lawyers argued that the jury had been given an impossible task, asked to comprehend the nuances of dissociative identity disorder without sufficient guidance or context. They submitted new psychiatric evaluations and scholarly articles on DID, hoping to convince appellate judges that her mental state was a powerful mitigating factor that had not been given proper weight during her sentencing. They contended that her original trial counsel had been ill-equipped to handle such a complex and novel psychiatric defense, thus constituting ineffective assistance of counsel, a constitutional argument for a new trial. These appeals, however, were systematically denied. The appellate courts, deferential to the jury's original findings of fact, were consistently unwilling to second-guess the verdict. The legal system had made its judgment on the matter of Billy, and it was not prepared to reverse it. As the legal avenues narrowed, the focus of the battle shifted from the courtroom to the court of public opinion and ultimately to the office of the governor of North Carolina, James Jim Hunt. The fight for clemency became the final, desperate hope. This phase of the case is a classic example of how a legal battle can transform into a political and moral crusade. The movement to save Velma Barfield gained significant momentum, attracting a diverse coalition of supporters. Prominent among them were staunch opponents of the death penalty, who saw her case as a perfect illustration of the cruelty and moral bankruptcy of capital punishment. They argued that executing a grandmother, particularly one who had demonstrated such profound remorse and rehabilitation, served no purpose other than state-sanctioned vengeance. This movement was powerfully amplified by influential figures within the evangelical Christian community, a demographic that traditionally held more conservative views on crime and punishment. The children of the world-renowned evangelist Billy Graham, particularly his daughter and Graham Lotz, became vocal advocates for Velma. They had visited her in prison, prayed with her, and had become utterly convinced of the sincerity of her religious conversion. They argued from a theological perspective, contending that divine forgiveness trumped earthly justice. If God had forgiven Velma Barfield, they asked, who was the state to demand her life? Their support lent a significant and unexpected weight to the clemency campaign, turning it into a front-page story and a genuine political dilemma for Governor Hunt. The public was deeply divided. On one side were those who saw the death row granny as a symbol of redemption. They were moved by her calm demeanor in television interviews, her soft-spoken words of faith, and a narrative of a broken woman who had found salvation. On the other side, equally passionate, were the families of her victims and their supporters. For them, this public campaign was a grotesque distortion of the truth. They saw the focus shifting away from the victims, Stuart Taylor, Jennings Barfield, Lily Bullard, the Lees, and onto the perpetrator. They remembered the agony of their loved ones, the slow, torturous deaths by arsenic, and the profound, intimate betrayal at the hands of a caregiver. They saw her prison conversion not as a sign of redemption, but as her final, most audacious act of manipulation. To them, commuting her sentence would be the ultimate injustice, a final victory for a woman who had already stolen so much. They argued that the good Velma being presented to the public was the same mask she had always worn, and to fall for it again would be an insult to the memory of those she had murdered. This conflict placed Governor Hunt in an incredibly difficult position, a scenario heavily analyzed by political scientists and legal scholars studying the politics of the death penalty. He was a popular Democratic governor in a largely conservative southern state, and he was known as a proponent of capital punishment. Granting clemency would alienate a significant portion of his political base and open him up to accusations of being soft on crime. Denying clemency, however, would mean defying the impassioned pleas of prominent religious leaders and human rights groups, and authorizing the first execution of a woman in the United States in over 2 decades. His office was flooded with thousands of letters, phone calls, and petitions from both sides. The governor and his legal team conducted an exhaustive review of the case. They examined the trial transcripts, the psychiatric reports, and the arguments presented in the clemency petition. They were tasked with determining if there was any compelling reason, any doubt about her guilt, any procedural error, any overwhelming mitigating factor that would justify overriding the verdict and sentence delivered by the jury and affirmed by every appellate court. The central question remained the same one that had haunted the trial. Who was Velma Barfield? Was she the penitent grandmother portrayed by her supporters, or the cold-hearted poisoner described by the prosecution? In the final days before the scheduled execution date of November 2nd, 1984, the tension reached its peak. Her lawyers filed last-minute appeals with the Supreme Court of the United States, which were swiftly denied. All legal avenues were now exhausted. The decision rested solely and squarely on the shoulders of Governor Hunt. After a final, intensive review and what he described as a period of prayer and deep consideration, he announced his decision. He would not grant clemency. In his official statement, the governor explained his reasoning. He acknowledged the sincerity of the arguments made on her behalf and recognized her apparent religious conversion. However, he stated that his duty was to uphold the law and the verdict of the jury system. The jury, he noted, had heard all the evidence, including the testimony about her troubled past and her psychological state, and had still recommended the ultimate penalty. He found no legal or factual basis to overturn their decision. The sentence, he concluded, was just punishment for the heinous nature of her crimes. The final appeal had failed. The machinery of state-sanctioned death, paused for years, began to move once more. Velma Barfield's final hours were now counting down. The final hours of a life on death row are a study in institutional ritual. The last meal, the final visits, the spiritual counseling, the quiet walk to the execution chamber. Each step is a prescribed and somber part of a process designed to bring a life to a close with administrative order. For Velma Barfield, her last day on Earth was a continuation of the persona she had cultivated for years as the death row granny. She met with her family, she prayed with her spiritual advisors, and by all accounts, she faced her impending death with a serene and unsettling calm. She reportedly turned down a special last meal, opting instead for a simple snack of cheese puffs and a Coca-Cola, a small, humanizing detail that stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the occasion. Her final public statement was not one of defiance or last-minute pleas, but an expression of love for her family and a reaffirmation of her Christian faith, ending with a wish that everyone might find peace. On November 2nd, 1984, in the early hours of the morning at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, Velma Barfield was led to the execution chamber. Her execution was itself a grim, historical landmark. She was the first woman to be executed in the United States since the Supreme Court had reinstated capital punishment in 1976. Furthermore, she was the first person in the nation to be executed by the method of lethal injection, which was then being promoted as a more humane and clinical alternative to the electric chair or the gas chamber. Her death was therefore not just the end of a legal battle, but the beginning of a new era in the practice of capital punishment. As she was strapped to the gurney and the intravenous lines were inserted into her arms, the fundamental, unanswerable questions about her identity, manipulator or penitent, monster or victim, seemed to hang in the sterile air of the chamber. She closed her eyes and, within minutes, was pronounced dead. The execution brought a definitive end to Velma Barfield's life, but it only amplified her legacy as a subject of intense academic and public fascination. Her case has endured for decades as a rich and multifaceted object of study, a single narrative that intersects with the core concerns of criminology, forensic psychology, law, and sociology. In the field of criminology, Velma Barfield remains a quintessential case study of a specific and terrifying subtype of female serial killer, the Black Widow or Angel of Death. Scholarly analysis of her crimes provides a near-perfect template for this offender profile. Her methods, the clandestine, patient use of poison, are classic for female offenders who lack the physical strength to overpower victims and prefer a low-visibility, intimate form of violence. Her victimology, the targeting of intimate partners, family members, and helpless dependents within the domestic or caregiver sphere, is a hallmark of this typology. Criminologists use her case to illustrate how female serial offenders often operate with a quiet violence that can go undetected for years, precisely because it is masked by the socially sanctioned roles of wife, mother, or nurse, and occurs within the sanctum of the home, a place of presumed trust. Her consistent financial motive, coupled with the psychological gratification she appeared to derive from the attention and sympathy her role as a grieving caregiver garnered, makes her a complete and complex example of this predatory type. In the realm of legal studies, her trial stands as a landmark case, particularly for its prominent and ultimately unsuccessful use of the dissociative identity disorder defense in a capital case. Legal scholars and students continue to dissect the trial as a case study in the immense challenges the adversarial legal system faces when confronted with complex, evolving, and often controversial psychiatric claims. The battle of the experts that took place in her courtroom highlights the difficulty juries face when asked to weigh a concrete, fact-based reality against a highly abstract psychological theory. The case serves as a cautionary tale for defense attorneys about the high evidentiary bar required to make such a defense successful, and for prosecutors on how to effectively counter it by grounding the narrative in the methodical, goal-oriented behavior of the defendant. Furthermore, the political and legal wrangling over her clemency petition remains a key case study in the politics of capital punishment, demonstrating how a single case can become a focal point for national debates on redemption, justice, and the moral authority of the state. For forensic psychology, the mind of Velma Barfield is a deep and enduring well of analysis. She is a case study that encompasses a wide spectrum of pathological and behavioral issues. Her documented history of severe childhood trauma provides a classic etiological backdrop for the development of severe personality disorders. Her long-term prescription drug abuse offers a window into the comorbidity of substance dependence and violent crime. Her ability to construct and maintain multiple, highly convincing social personas, from the devoted caregiver to the fractured victim of Billy to the redeemed Christian penitent, makes her a masterclass in manipulative behavior and the construction of self-serving narratives. The central, unresolved question of her true nature, whether she was a cynical malingerer or a genuinely disordered individual, continues to make her a subject of psychological debate. She forces students and practitioners to confront the blurred lines between conscious deception and unconscious defense mechanisms, between performance and identity. Ultimately, the story of Velma Barfield is a profoundly chilling and cautionary tale that resonates far beyond academic circles. It is a story about the terrifying fragility of human trust and the horrifying possibility that the hand that offers comfort can also be the hand that delivers death. Her life and crimes serve as a permanent, academically documented reminder that the most profound forms of horror do not always come from a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they emanate from the person sitting right at the bedside, smiling kindly, speaking of faith, and offering a fresh and fatal cup of tea. Her execution provided a legal end to the story, but the questions she left behind continue to haunt the disciplines that seek to understand the darkest corners of the human mind.